Eduardo Berti was born in Buenos Aires in 1964 and is the author of a vast body of work that includes novels, stories, music, writing, and various unclassifiable books. He has translated authors such as Gustave Flaubert and Jane Austen into Spanish and is the editor of the Spanish edition of Henry James's Complete Stories. A member of the OuLiPo since 2014, he lives in Bordeaux. So Berti will be in conversation with Levin Becker, who was born in Chicago in 1984, is the author of many subtle channels in praise of potential literature, and the translator of, among many books, Georges Perec's La Boutique Obscure. And Levin Becker has been a member also of the OuLiPo since 2009. Thank you so much for being with us this evening at the library.
Thanks so much, Alice. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to our Zoom heads. And thank you, Eduardo, for joining us from Bordeaux.
Thank you. Thank you. It's always a pleasure to see you in Paris or elsewhere.
So yeah, we are celebrating the release of An Ideal Presence, which is the first title from Fern Books, a hot young publisher to watch. And the book came out officially in September, but obviously with the global supply chain being what it is, things have been a little slow to get started. So it's all soft launch all the way down. But I thought maybe we would start with you just telling us a little bit about this project and how it came about and the process by which you made it happen.
Okay. Some years ago, around 2015, I was invited by Roan's public hospital, the Rouen, the city in the north of France. They invited me to share, but not to share, but to be near the caregivers, to watch the daily work, to experience the daily work. And all they expected was small text, about 5 or 10 pages. And I quickly realized that 5 or 10 pages was frustrating because all the things that I was experiencing there, they were so rich and so complex also that I really needed to write a longer text. And I discovered that I wanted and needed to write a book. That was not the initial project. So I told them this, and we managed to change a bit the whole thing. And finally, instead of staying only 2 or 3 weeks, I spent almost 6 months coming and going, leaving, staying, and I wrote this book that was a big surprise for me.
So just to situate things a little bit, this book takes place in the palliative care unit of this hospital in Rouen. And the format, which we'll talk about a little bit later, the structure is it's a series of testimonials or monologues from the people who work there. The doctors, the nurses, the nursing aides, and also volunteer readers, volunteer musicians, estheticians, there's some porters, etc. And notably, you don't hear any monologues from patients or patients' families. They're very present in the book, but it's all viewed through the lens of these people whose daily work is to be surrounded by people at the end of their life. So one thing I actually don't know is when you started this residency or this project for the festival, were you exclusively in the palliative care unit or did you move around the hospital a bit?
At the beginning, I moved between 2 units, but finally I stayed and I did the whole residence among the caregivers of the palliative unit. I think we choose each other. I think that they wanted me. They really wanted me. They really wanted this presence of a writer that was going to listen to all the stories and all the things they wanted to tell me. And I really found that this was perhaps one of the most interesting places because it's so different also. It's, yeah, I think we choose each other. Yeah.
Well put. This is it really is a universe unto itself, and a great segue for which I thank you, as though we had planned it ahead of time. For me to read, I'd like to read the first piece from the book, which is spoken by a nursing aide named Pauline Jourdain. So this is the opening of the book. Besides, there's a little author's note from Eduardo. No, I won't be reading your book. You've come here, I'm told, to put our work, our reality, into words. I haven't read anything of yours, I'm sorry. Perhaps I'm prejudiced, but each time I see doctors or nurses or nursing aides in a novel, in a film or on television, honestly, I want to laugh. Either it's excessive, a catalog of cheap dramas, or it's embellished, rose-colored. But it's never true. No, never. Because when they exaggerate, when they use our work to present a spectacle of human suffering, even in those cases, the images are so over the top you'd think they were special effects. So you'll excuse me, but I'm not going to read your book. I'm afraid I won't see anything I recognize in it, that I'll discover a washed out version of my testimony, or worse, that I'll feel betrayed. That said, if I've agreed to speak to you, it's not only to tell you I won't be reading your book. I agreed above all because I never refuse to speak about what I do. It must be quite different for you when a writer, an architect, a chef, a lawyer, an actor is invited to a dinner party and starts talking about his or her work. Maybe people say, oh, how interesting. Or maybe they think, oh, how boring. But nobody ever dares to say, stop talking about your work, you're ruining dinner. Nurses and nursing aides know that's what everyone is thinking in their case. It happens to us so often that many of us have developed a prudent habit of just staying silent, at least outside our circle. How many of my colleagues have you spoken to? Have they told you about the funeral makeup, the vomit, the cleaning tasks of hospital workers? Are you going to describe all of that? Are you going to ruin the reader's dinner? Really? I'm asking because I won't read you, no matter how you answer. Which I think is just such a magnificent way to begin a book. On it's like any book that began like that, I would be hooked immediately. But I think, especially in a project like this, where you're sort of creating the presence of yourself as the author, this thing that you were talking about being desired by the people in this unit, which comes with a great responsibility to sort of represent and make legible their world, their universe, and their experience. And also to not make it off-putting, to not ruin the reader's dinner, as you put it so beautifully. And at the same time to maintain the presence of yourself as the author. And so throughout the book, there's no narrator besides the people who we hear from, but there is nonetheless a presence of you as the author who's in the unit, taking notes, talking to people, listening to stories, interviewing people. And it comes back, maybe there are 4 or 5 pieces in the book where you in the second person are referred to. But I think it's such a beautiful way to strike that balance between you as the person who's bearing witness and the people whose stories you want to tell, and sort of way of mediating between what is in many ways a very intense daily experience that they have and the comfort of readers like me or any of us who might be interested without knowing that we're interested and are curious, but maybe a little bit, what's the word, have a weak stomach for that kind of thing.
Well, you said that I was mediating. I really felt that I was really doing that kind of mediation job work. So I wanted to be honest, not to disappear completely, to remind, like you say, 4 or 5 times, to remind that those stories were told to somebody. Then, yeah, in the other 50 or 60, I disappear completely because it's better. So the reader, it's like in a tete-a-tete with these stories. No, I'm not bothering. But in 2 or 3, I appear. For example, in one story where somebody tells me that her brother wanted to be a writer. You know, when I found that it was more or less appropriate to appear a little bit, I did it. But if not, I try to disappear. Yeah.
Yeah, but the ways that you come back are really, really very effective, I find, and sort of, they don't take you out of it so much as resituate the experience that we're all having. So to stay with this theme of the reader being maybe a little weak in the stomach, this kind of thing, how conscious were you of picking and choosing the experiences that you wanted to portray or embellish or select? And maybe we should pause and say that these are lightly fictionalized. These are not direct testimonials. These are not verbatim, and the people's names are not the people's names. And we can talk a little bit about the mechanics of that in a little bit. But I'm interested in the way you kept the reader in mind, both as you were assembling the final product of what was going to become this book, and as you were talking to the people that you were talking to in the unit.
Yeah, I felt like the first reader of this book. I had like a panoply. I had a lot of stories, and I felt that I could choose and I could invent also. We'll talk about that. And so I think that I had one thing very, very clear from the beginning, that it was a perspective. I really wanted to talk about all this world from the perspective of the caregivers. I really thought that this perspective was different, that there are a lot of books or stories or novels or films that show what happens in a hospital or in a unit like this one. But when this is shown in fiction, it's shown like an exceptional thing, extraordinary thing. Of course, it's extraordinary. End of life, big pain, death is something. It's not the usual thing we live during our life, day by day. I mean, but for these people that work there, this is the routine. This is the quotidien.
Yeah, this is their day-to-day life.
The day-to-day. And this perspective was interesting. Because the question was finally, what is to live in this universe? How is to live? How do you live professionally and personally in a universe where death is so omnipresent? And so that was like the main thing. And I tried to look at this question through a lot of different angles, because choosing the perspective of the caregivers allowed me to talk about the relationship between caregivers and patients, relationship between caregivers and families, relationship between caregivers, even at the same level and also different roles, different levels, and also what happens with these caregivers outside, with their families, their friends. So this allowed me a lot of small perspectives also.
I'm just thinking about the cliche that when you start looking for it, you see it everywhere. A character in a movie or a novel who says, "I hate hospitals. You know, they make me think of death," or "I had a bad experience," whatever. It's like, in a way, it's the least interesting way you can introduce the world of hospitals and the world of medical care into a piece of fiction or a piece of writing. It's like trying a doorknob and it turning out to be open. You see it everywhere once you start looking for it. And so I think that's another really smart move on your part, to say, instead of "I hate hospitals," you're not having people say "I love hospitals," which would be maybe too radical a departure. But for people to say, "I feel neither good nor bad about hospitals. That's the water in which I swim every day. That's my reality." And that I'm thinking also about a lot of people who've read this book, who've told us after we published it that they were very apprehensive about reading it. I think in a way that comes from the same place. People think this is going to be a very heavy book. It's going to be about death. It's going to be about loss. It's going to be about pain of the end of life. And so many people who took the plunge and read the book came back to us and said, in fact, it wasn't dark at all. It was actually a very light, uplifting book. We had a lot of people who lost parents or grandparents during the pandemic and weren't able to be with them. And some people told us, reading this book was really helpful because it allowed me to imagine the kind of care I hope this family member had in their last days, which I think is a really lovely accomplishment. Maybe we can have an audio reading. So one thing that we did, we talked about this before we published the book, was how well these testimonials lend themselves to something like an audiobook, to being read dramatically. So we don't have an audiobook in the works just yet, but we asked some people, some friends, some people close to us to do some readings of some of the chapters. So we're going to listen to one right now.
This is Delphine.
This is Delphine Ziegler, who is a nurse.
The hardest thing for me is seeing children of 4, 5, 6 in the hallway, especially when the patient is their father or their mother. You've seen little Leia, I imagine. Her mother has been in the unit for 3 weeks. Her father or her aunt goes to pick her up from school. She comes here for a little while before going home. She stays longer on the weekends, in the room with a TV and some children's books, the piano, the sofa, the table, and the kitchenette. I help her a bit with her homework sometimes. I have a daughter her age. It's easy. No, easy isn't the word. It's very hard, as I said before. But paradoxically, it also helps to have a child here. Children keep us from getting depressed. We can't just stop. They're the life that goes on. This morning, going from Leia's mother's room to the staff lounge, I see that the girl seems sadder than usual, almost distraught. So I quickly think of a little speech. I breathe deep. I kneel down in front of her and let my words out, telling myself the whole time that above all, I have to listen to her. Soon, Leia explains to me that she's sad because her teddy bear has a long stain on its belly. A blood stain, Leia says. A chocolate stain, explains her father, who's sitting next to her. The teddy bear, dirty and stinky, sets the whole unit in motion, as if it were a desperate case. Emergency cleanup, fragile object. A few minutes later, the bear comes out of the dryer, emerging from behind the porthole window, like some kind of astronaut. It's still warm when I place it into Leia's hands. Is that better like that? Yes, the little girl says to me. Her eyes are shining. He's cured.
Between April and December
Too much. Double Eduardo. Thank you, Alice. That was a reading done by my mom. Thanks, Mom. So I translated this book, and I've read the book in one way or another probably a dozen times, and there's some pieces, including that one, that still kind of bring tears to my eyes that I find so poignant and so lovely. And this one in particular, because Delphine puts it beautifully, it's the life that goes on. It's this reminder that palliative care unit in a hospital is not just death. It's not just the end of life, and that not only are there people who are affected by loss, but there are people who are living their lives. This is a place where, like any other place where people congregate, it's a nexus of a lot of different lives at different stages of being lived. And the sweetness in that chapter, I think, is really, really remarkable. So I guess my question is, thinking of things like the sweetness, this is getting to the question that we put off earlier of how you went about crafting and fictionalizing where you fictionalize these stories. The question I want to ask is, how much of the sweetness and how much of the poignancy did you find in your encounters, in your interviews, in your conversations with the members of the unit, and how much was your addition? How much was your fabrication or your embellishment?
No, I really tried not to embellish things. I really tried to be faithful to what I saw. And choosing this perspective, of course, the point of view of the caregivers. I saw also the moments when they were between them laughing, the moments when they were fragile because some of them was like having really problems with the family or with the patient, or bringing problems from the outside world. And so I saw all that in the day by day, in my daily experience. And I tried to show all this, not to embellish and not to, the two things I wanted to avoid was to embellish things and to go all the time to the pathos, the thing. Because to me, it was not true to choose one way or the other. I really tried to reflect the variety of things I saw. Yeah. Because also each caregiver was very different. I mean, there were people that were working, perhaps spending their last weeks or months, very experienced, mostly women, very also, sometimes they were very, very young women that was starting and having their first patients. So I wanted to reflect all this variety in many levels. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when you tell us about the process of, you talk about after your initial stay in the unit, you had these notebooks that you filled up. And so what was the process like of taking what you put down in the notebooks? What happened to them on their way to becoming this book? I know, like you've told me in the past that there's some pieces in the book that are kind of aggregations of different stories. Some are little things that you invented and sort of superimposed on an existing base. Tell us about that.
Yeah, but basically I worked, I don't know, I had like, it was not my initial idea. I discovered how to write this book through the days, through the weeks. But I realized now that I finished, that I worked, I had like 4 strategies, we can say like that. Sometimes I was really faithful and to a story. There are not a lot of cases, but there are 5 or 6 examples where I had to choose the way of what I wrote it. I made a choice how to write this down, but the story was like perfect, Only 4 or 5 cases. A lot of the second strategy, a lot of cases where I mixed things, 2 or 3 elements. Another third strategy, I invented a lot, but always being more very, very respectful to the professional work or as of the caregivers. In the professional level, I invented nothing. And a 4th strategy I started to explore at the end, mostly. I arrived with possible situations. I arrived and said to 1 or 2 caregivers, what would happen if tomorrow somebody, a member of family, comes and asks you this thing? What would you answer? What would happen if a patient do this or asks this? And it was very, very interesting because sometimes the answer was, well, this already happened. Sometimes the answer was, well, we had similar situations, and sometimes it was, I don't know, let me think. So they were like inventing with me or writing with me the stories.
Yeah, that's a really lovely thought that you were there, not only passively absorbing what was going on, but also sort of introducing elements and seeing how they played out, which is sort of a lovely fusion of the work of a fiction writer and the work of a journalist, both of which you have been.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I didn't want to work as a traditional journalist. I did not register with your call. Yeah, I knew I didn't find the word. I didn't recall the conversations. I didn't take notes in presence of them. But when I was alone, I took notes because there were some expressions I didn't want to lose. And but I didn't work with the factual rigor of a journalist. I wanted to be more elastic also. Yeah.
And I know also that you were very scrupulous about respecting the methodology and the professional level, and that you showed the text to members of the unit.
Yeah, I did two readings. I read some texts that were perhaps not in a final version, but were quite advanced, in order to see the reactions and to have some commentaries. And when the book was finished, 4 people that worked there, and also a friend of mine that works as a doctor in Spain, read the book, because I didn't want to say to commit mistakes at the medical level. You know, I really wanted to be serious and not to.
Right, I imagine, because also, I mean, you've spoken to me before about almost a constraint was not really engaging on that level. That except maybe there are a few pieces where the nuts and bolts of a medical intervention are discussed, but for the most part, it's non-technical.
It's not technical. No. I made 2 or 3 choices. One choice was, as I said before, the point of view. The other was the structure, the form, the monologues, and also this choice, not making a technical book. It's not divulgation. It's more human. What I tried.
Yeah, and I imagine if it were more technical, then you would set yourself up for more ways to be imprecise or inaccurate, which would take people out of it if they have some experience in this world. But let's talk a little more about the structure that you found. So you had, I'm imagining that at a certain point during the process of collecting all of this data, you had a bunch of different vignettes by different characters. What happened for you to arrive at the book as we read it now, which I will say, among other things, there are characters, no character speaks to the reader more than once. Everyone gets one chapter, but characters come back. They're discussed by other people.
Yeah. And everybody that works in the unit speaks once. That's the idea and the structure. Yeah, as you say, I had a lot of vignettes, a lot of ideas, and the first idea that came to me, quite traditional idea. Let's see if I can find the story, the big story, the acts, and then I can perhaps encrust. No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
find the through line.
Yeah, and I can insert the other stories. But no, I quickly understood that it was not the big idea. And I was I was rereading a book that I really love and I always recommend. That it's from an American writer, William March, and the book is called Company K. William March fought in the First World War, and some years after, he wrote this book where he pays homage to his companions, and he uses this structure that I discovered in this book. He makes, he gives the word, the speech, one by one to every member of the military unit. And each one of them tells a story, even those that die, which is, it's very emotive. It's like he gives them the last word or another choice another chance to speak. And this is the structure of William March's book, that is a wonderful book, besides. And I said to me that I love this structure, and I think it's interesting if I use it exactly 1 century later, because it was exactly 1 century later to depict, thank you, a feminine world, not a masculine universe like the army, and not a machine, a killing machine as the army, but perhaps the contrary, or at least a machine that tries to avoid pain, suffering, and death. And I said, well, it's interesting if I can use the form to make to make a book so different, also.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I read Company K after reading your book because you talk about it in your author's note, and it is fascinating because it's the same structure. You have these different, you have these self-contained stories that together in aggregate form this sort of pointillist painting of the brutality of war. But it is, as you say, almost the opposite effect. Like I was talking about people saying they were trepidatious about reading this book because they thought it was going to be really heavy, and it turned out that it was actually light and uplifting, which is not at all the case with Company K. It's like you expect it to be difficult and heavy, and it is difficult. I mean, it's a brutal book. It's beautifully done, but it's very hard to read. And I love that idea of not only finding the structure that you like and think could be conducive to something you're doing, but being so thoughtful about it and saying, what can I tinker with? What can I take? What elements can I switch to their opposite? What can I subvert? And how can I make this sort of an instrument to tell a different kind of story in the same shape?
Well, I love that when you find in a story that already exists already, or in a form that exists already, other possibilities. You know, that's perhaps is my Utopian side also, but it's something that I don't always work like this, but sometimes it happens that I see like other possibilities in a form or in a story. What I did with Nathaniel Hawthorne's short story Wakefield. I loved this story that is a big classic, not only from American literature, I think from universal literature. I read it because it was one of Borges' favorite short stories. And suddenly I said to myself, and if we write the same story, but from the perspective of the wife, of Wakefield's wife. And
this is a story about a man who leaves his home and disappears for 20 years, right? But doesn't actually go anywhere. He just stays nearby, watching.
He stays in the corner of the street to watch his absence.
And so you wrote a book called Mrs. Wakefield, which is, as you say, it's the same core story told from a different perspective that arrives at a different perspective on the same universe.
And it's a different story finally, because it's a different story. I always give the same example. If you tell the story of the boy that has 18 years old and says to their parents, "I'm leaving." If you tell it from the perspective of the young boy, it's a Bildungsroman. You know, it's wonderful. It's a young kid discovering the world. But you can tell it from imagine the two old fathers, parents, the only son, and it's like a dark story, sad, perhaps. You can tell like another story. You can tell, even you can change the genre, the gender.
Yeah, and that goes back to what you were doing in a way with an ideal presence. You're making space for a different perspective. Like, people think hospitals, they think palliative care, they think death, but you're making space for other stories, for people whose lives are, I don't want to say neutral, but whose lives are based in this world, and they have their own lives, and they have their own feelings and their own sources of lightness and joy. And it's a very...
But because from the beginning, I thought that it was a privilege, because they were sharing with me this perspective that is not the usual perspective. And except if you have a friend that works there, you can have it. But to me, it was not the usual perspective. And so they were very, very generous with me, telling me, showing me their feelings, the daily work. And so I tried to use this perspective because it was really, I found it was a privilege. Yeah.
Should we listen to another recording? Yes. So this one is Danielle Pourcely, who is also a nursing aide.
I had just arrived in the unit and a nurse was retiring. They'd put together a going away party. Someone had brought in a few bottles of champagne. We don't drink on the job, except when it's a patient's birthday and the family comes in with a bottle. In that case, we're often invited to join, and the custom is to accept and take a tiny sip, nothing more. But that day, this nurse was drinking. It was her last day and she was overwhelmed. We were in our kitchen and suddenly she handed me a glass and started telling me about a patient she'd known at the beginning of her career in the 80s. The man was old, nothing left but skin and bones. He didn't speak to anyone. He seemed indifferent to everything, and she felt invisible to him. Nonetheless, one morning when she was alone with him in his room, she heard the bed creak and the old man's voice asking her very politely if she could show him her breasts. At first she thought it was a joke. She was going to laugh, but suddenly she thought better of it. Maybe he was delirious, maybe it was an extravagance caused by the morphine. So she took the precaution of not saying anything. She acted as though, for once, it was him, the patient, who was invisible. The next day, though, the man tried again. She just responded by shaking her head, but the man was obstinate. "In 2 weeks, I'll be gone. This is all I ask of you. You're the youngest one here, the prettiest, the sweetest, the only one who's not married, if I'm not mistaken." No, indeed, he was not mistaken. But the idea was scandalous. Who did he take her for? "I'm sorry, but I don't think that would be right," she said. The man insisted, still with the same arguments. "You're not like the others. You're extraordinary." She saw him there, in his bed. He had a pleasing way of smiling. And his voice, above all, his voice was seductive. No doubt he'd been a handsome man. Back then, she was still living with her parents. Naturally, she didn't tell them anything about all this. But the man was indefatigable. "2 breasts, please, or at least 1 breast." One day, she thought, why not? The man was going to die soon. The fleeting vision of a breast was an easy charity to give him. An insignificant thing compared to his suffering. It would remain between her and him. And after the old man's death, it would remain in her mind as an amusing story in a series of rather morbid memories. She decided to do it and said to herself, the ideal time to do it is the day after tomorrow, Thursday, when I'll be on the night shift. There won't be many people around and nobody will see us. The man died the next day, a day before. Perhaps it was for the best. She wasn't very religious, but she couldn't help thinking that God wanted it this way. A week later, during a coffee break, another nurse confided in her that the man who just died had asked her to undo her hair and show him her thighs. He'd used 1,000 arguments to try to convince her, you're so pretty, you're so unique. She never found out whether this nurse had acquiesced to the patient's wishes. Today, she said, she suspected the man had asked the same thing of all her colleagues. All told, even if she hadn't had time to accept his proposition, even if she'd perhaps been the only one not to go all the way with it, she exaggerated 3 decades later, it was still a funny memory, the perfect memory to share on the occasion of her last day of work.
Thanks. So to jump ahead, this is the last question I'll ask before we open things up to the in-person and Zoom audiences. Is you wrote this book in French, and this is the first full-length book that you've written in French. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, this was like a chain of surprises. I wrote a book that I didn't expect to write, and I wrote it in French. At the beginning, I was taking notes, and I was discovering all this universe in French. So I didn't want to lose their way of speaking. I didn't want to lose the words. You know,
You said there were some phrases that you wrote down because you didn't want to lose them.
Yeah, I didn't want to lose all that. And I said to myself, well, of course I'm going to translate it. I'm going to write it in Spanish. But not only it was difficult to translate it, sometimes I didn't find the words. It was complicated. But also, this is a book made of voices. And each time I tried to continue writing, or even to start a story in Spanish, it was like if these voices stopped. It was strange, but these voices were in French. And it was very difficult to me, as a mediator, as you said at the beginning, I was like a good medium in French. And in Spanish, I was a very bad mediator. I don't know why, but it was something beyond my control. And so as the worst thing we can do in those cases is to stop writing, or to go against these voices. So I went on in French. And suddenly I discovered how I wrote in French. I didn't know. And I also discovered that, of course, it was simpler. No, not poorer. I wouldn't say poorer, but it was more direct. Mm. And for the book I wanted to write, it was good. It was really better than the possible stylish Eduardo Berti in Spanish. I guessed that, I thought that. So finally I went on, and I did it in French. But I couldn't write it in Spanish. It was not so much a choice.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
Thank you so much. Can we have a round of applause, please? Any questions in the room? Yes.
Can you just tell me what the feedback has been like from the carers in the hospital? And do you know if that nurse at the very beginning still hasn't read it, or whether in fact, whether in fact she changed her mind and did read the book afterwards?
Well, the feedback I have is good, but as usual, when people read a book, it's more common that people approach you to say that they liked it that to say that they did not like it. So perhaps somebody did not like it, but nobody told me that from.
Maybe more common for you.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, but usually, I mean. But I know that most of them, because they told me, were touched by the book. They recognized themselves, and especially they recognized the unit. They recognized the daily reality, and they were, yeah, they were thankful. They told me because of my work. My answer was that I was more thankful because I really did discover not only a universe but also a very special unit and people that had a big engagement and a big passion for their work. But well, they told me they were very, very emotional, very, very thankful. Concerning this lady, well, I might disappoint you, but this lady, like this, exactly didn't exist. I invented this character. I mean, nobody told me exactly those words, but I built this text from a couple of elements, from 2 or 3 regards or attitudes that made me think that perhaps they were thinking about this, and I think they were. And I had 2 or 3 elements that I used in the text. The how difficult for them is to talk about this work, how critical they are when they see fiction that talks about their work, the thing that they always want to talk about their work because they are very proud of it. The text is made of real elements that 2 or 3 of them told me. But I built this character because I don't know. I think that this way I could also use this text to express a couple of things. Yeah, it's like a pact with the reader. This text.
I once read a modern ethnography of paramedics in the US, and they had this shorthand with each other. It was a way for them to relieve their stress of this incredibly intense job. And it ended up being quite macabre and hilarious. That was their way of communicating. And I wondered if you witnessed a kind of shorthand among them and a different way that they communicated with you. And how about the sense of humor? Did you find that they used that as a tool?
Yes, no doubt about that. They use the humor as a tool. They also have a psychologist for them that is always there. And they are very conscious that their work is very stressful. So they really try to take some holidays and some breaks and breathe and come back. And also in this unit, they told me that some years ago, 3 or 4 years before my arrival to the unit, they had tried to keep like a diary where they wrote. They did it for a couple of months, but yeah, I love the idea, and it's a pity that they didn't go on. They wrote like a souvenir from each patient. It was like an exercise, and so I think they had in mind also this idea of keeping like a record, a memoir of the memory of the history. Yeah.
Did you get to see it?
No. It was like a big mystery. I tried to. I asked, and We lost it. I don't know. Perhaps they didn't want me to show how they wrote. Perhaps they were like, yeah.
We have a question on Zoom.
Yeah.
And we have people tuning in from all over the world. So this is a question from Shira, who's in the US. She's in Connecticut currently, but she's originally from New York. I imagine that she wants me to precise that. She asks, did writing the book change your feelings or thoughts about death, dying, and the like?
Yeah. This is a question that sometimes they ask me, and the answer I usually give is that this experience changed mostly my regard or my feelings about life. Because it's something that, as I said at the beginning, I spent 6 months, but I did. I came back home, took some distance, went back to Rouen, and each time I went home and I spoke with my wife, my friends, etc. What I said was, and this experience is like putting in a real scale a couple of things, and that was one of the. It changed the scale and how you think and how you feel about the daily problems that of course are big problems in our small life, but you put it like in a real scale. And I think I think that there were two big lessons from the caregivers. One was how to I don't find even the word in French. It's a big problem. How to, what I would say, honor. Yeah, how to. Yeah, it's a good word. How to honor life. No, that was one of the big lessons the caregivers gave me. And the other lesson is the lesson that it's in the title of the book. One night I talked with a nurse, and she asked me, "Well, how are you? How is this experience going on for you?" And my first answer was, "Well, I'm still trying to find my ideal distance." And she smiled and she told me, "Well, for years and years, I tried to find my ideal distance. And now, since some years, I understand that what I really need to find here and in life in general is my ideal presence." And that was like a big lesson that even changed my feelings and how when I worked there, when I stayed there. That was also, and it's an idea. I think life should be our ideal presence in the world.
Daniel, can I ask you the same question? How did it change your response? And can you talk just briefly about the translation process too? Especially as you were working so closely with your friend.
Yeah, I mean, so the experience for me, I translated this book in 2019, I think, at a residency that Eduardo had actually recommended to me, which it was a pleasure to work on, and then, collaborating with you reading behind me and sort of saying, this doesn't sound quite right, this is, even editing slightly. That was a great pleasure. But the real, I think the real experience that I was marked by was thinking about publishing this book during the pandemic, when all of a sudden it felt like we were collectively very newly aware of the sacrifices and the difficulties of people in this profession, of their presence, of the pressures of their work, of just, how they are this vital line between life and death, and between life and all of these other uncertainties. And that felt, it was sort of a queasy kind of happy coincidence that this was a book we had decided to publish shortly before the pandemic started, and then we were, kind of going to take our time with it. And then after the first few months, when it became clear that this wasn't just something that was going to come and go, we felt a little more motivated. We said, this is actually something we want people to have access to. Like this was really meaningful and helpful. I know I'm kind of skirting your question, your and Shira's question, but I think it sort of left the realm of abstraction. Like I was thinking about there's a chapter toward the end of the book where that's a version of the person who says to you, I thought it was an ideal distance I was looking for, and ultimately I've realized that it's an ideal presence. That's another one of those chapters that every time I read them, wow. And but it was easy to sort of file that away and under, this is an interesting, philosophical distinction. And then that distinction really eroded, or so the philosophicalness of the distinction eroded over time, and it felt like this is actually something, these voices feel real, they have real purchase and real relevance to something that everyone is experiencing, that everyone always experiences, but that people are now experiencing under this new kind of duress, in these new situations where they're not able to be present physically while their loved ones are dying. They're not able to intervene or even have a sort of window into what's happening. And that felt, it felt really vital to be able to put that, these perspectives into the world. I feel like now I've completely wandered astray from the question. Translating it was great. I love the book. Eduardo is a joy to work with. I highly recommend any Persian Spanish translators in the audience to work with him. His French books are taken. We'll talk about that later. I hope you're cool with that. Okay. While I'm talking, I just want to, the second reading that we heard was by Helen Berti. I want to thank her.
Christina, would you like to add anything about your experience of publishing? So Daniel's saying we, and the other part.
Oh no, I meant the royal we. It's been me, God, and English.
Christina, who's a vital, integral part of the publishing process. I'd love to hear. You also can think, and I can come back to you.
Yeah, kind of like Daniel said, I mean, I think that in the early days of the lockdown and curfew and clapping out the window at 8 p.m. every night for the medical care providers, and not having really read anything or experienced anything that so gently and assuredly gave me access to the real lives of people who care professionally and deeply and for strangers was kind of the lifeline that I needed. And I think everyone needs different lifelines at different points in their lives, but I hope this book is something everyone can find the right moment for.
Yeah, like the clapping at the window was very meaningful to me, but thinking about it now, it was also kind of an abstraction. Like we were clapping, we were applauding the idea of medical care. And on our street, we live right across from a pharmacy, and sometimes at 8 o'clock, the guy would come out of the pharmacy and be like, no problem, my pleasure. But for the most part, it was really, it felt kind of detached from reality. And this was a really special way, I think, to feel rooted to the depth of that reality.
Thank you. Do we have any other in-person questions? Oh, okay. That is the end. We have a strict deadline. I'll ask one more because I received one on Zoom that I think is interesting and also raises a question that I certainly had talked about with Daniel when I first read it and then met with Daniel and Christina. Donna Osborne would like to know, what did you notice about the nurses' personalities so that they choose hospice care at this point in their careers? I'm a nurse and I worked in post-surgical ICUs because that suited my personality. I think what I want to highlight in that question is Donna assumes nurse, and nurse is such a kind of gendered word. Could you talk about maybe the question about the personalities and also the aspect of gender?
Yeah, I don't want to jump on general conclusions. It's not my idea with the book. But, however, I asked them, do you think that the choice of being a nurse implies some kind of personality or some kind of personal story? And what I try to reflect on the book is not so much my vision, but their proper visions. And the answer is given in one or two stories, where, for example, one nurse tells that when she was a small girl, she had to care and stay next to her grandmother. And perhaps, you never know, but perhaps she says it was there that this vocation started. And then in this same story, she tells like a small theory about 2 or 3 different causes, no, that could explain. But it's not my idea. I really didn't write this book to give theories. The small theories you find are more ideas or intuitions that they gave. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for coming out this evening. Thank you, Christina, too. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you to everyone on Zoom. I just noticed we had people from California, Oakland, California, from Geneva, Switzerland. We have people from various parts of the US. So thank you all so much for tuning in.